listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and as growers across the country wrap up seeding and planting, this can be a good time to head out and scout to see what kind of crop you're looking at for the 2025 growing season, and maybe even when you're scouting for weed or insect pressure, maybe you can have a look at things like stand counts, planting depths, or even root structures to give you a good indication of whether or not your equipment was set properly and how you could improve things for next year. Helping us with all of these things you want to look for this early in the growing season and why it matters is Jenna Gregoire, an area agronomist with Pioneer in northwestern and central west Saskatchewan. Holly Loucas is also an area agronomist covering the Norfolk to Niagara stretch of southwestern Ontario. And Ben Rosser is the corn specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness. Ben, Holly, Jenna, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Ben, I want to bring you in on this because it's one of those that for our area a little further south in Ontario, a lot of the stuff is actually coming up now. It's kind of the cold weather's past. We're doing that. And I think one of those really important discussions that we can have for every grower in the country is when we are going out to scout, this seems like a really good time to have a look at what that crop looks like, because it can be a pretty good sign to figure out how did the equipment actually, perform for us. What are some of the things that as growers we should be looking for, Ben?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, from kind of emergence to maybe a little bit before kind of knee-high corn stage is a great time to go out and look at things. Because at that stage, you can still get a pretty good idea of what's maybe causing some of the issues. So I think if you're going to go out, first thing I would do is bring a tape measure and a trowel. If you're already spending the time going out there, have some tools that allow you to do some diagnosis. So, maybe doing some populations just in the general sense. Are you dropping what you think you are? But I think, like you mentioned, Andrew, in terms of kind of red flags, if I'm going out and evaluating a stand, I'd be looking for gaps. And then if I see one, investigate why. Is the seed missing? Was it a metering issue with a planter? Or is there seed there and there's some other issue going on like insect feeding or fertilizer injury or something else that's maybe just stopped or has really slowed that seed from emerging? And then I think the other thing, especially once you're getting more leaves on, 4, 5, 6 leaf stage, looking for variability in that stand, particularly those laggard plants. If you see laggard plants, why are those plants behind the rest of them? Those would be red flags for me if I'm going out and looking at stands now.
Because emergence, and this is funny, I think it was just our last episode, we were talking to, David Hula, who does the, record corn thing. His big thing is not necessarily spacing is the issue, as that consistent emergence is such a critical thing, for the way he manages his crop. Why does it matter so much, Ben?
Yeah, so I think the big challenge is, if you get a plant that gets behind the rest, it just does not have the ability to compensate, or it doesn't have the ability to catch up to its neighbors if there's others close by that are well ahead of it. And those neighbors don't seem to be able to compensate for that one being there, but being a laggard plant. If you've got some variability in spacing, they do have some ability to compensate for differences in space, but differences in staging, we just don't compensate, and those laggards end up costing yield at the end of the day.
Jenna, Ben used the term red flags, which I think is a really great way to kind of phrase the things that we're looking for. In a canola crop, what do you look for, or what do you, when you're talking to your growers, what are you telling them they need to look for as kind of the red flags in a canola crop at this time, at this stage of the growing season?
Well, a lot of it is survivability is a really big one. We order our seed based on our calculations for how many plants per square foot we are targeting. So, on average, we're targeting about 70%, but there's a very big variety of seeding units out there. And some of them, those survivabilities are upwards towards, 90, 95%. So the biggest thing is I need guys to get out there, count how many plants they have in there, and then adjust for the following years based on what the conditions are going to be like. If we have good conditions and they're seeing 90% survivability, it's equating to, over 10 plus plants per square foot. I had a guy where he had 16 plants per square foot. Now, if this drought continues and we've got 16 plants per square foot, that crop is absolutely going to suffer just with these tall, spindly plants that aren't getting enough nutrients up for them. So that's probably the number one, because everybody thinks that they like to see a nice mat of canola out there, but sometimes that can be more of a detriment than, having less than 6 plants per square foot. So that one's a big one. And plus, I always like to ask guys to check to see if they had any mechanical problems out there as well. Because if they wait too long, those mechanical problems, they can't really tell, and it's much harder to try and diagnose those, when you're in the swather, when you're in the combine in the fall, as opposed to in the springtime, when potentially you could do something to rectify the problem.
Holly, what about red flags that you see, and that you hear about? What are some of the other ones that you think are really important? And Ben focused a lot on corn, maybe even into soybeans too. What are some of those things that growers should be looking for?
I think one thing that we haven't touched on too much yet was planting depth. I think get out there, dig up some plants, and start looking at, maybe you targeted your planter for 2 inches, just checking to make sure were those seeds actually placed at 2 inches. It's better to know now than in the fall, and you don't, like Jenna was saying, in the fall it's hard to tell what the problem was. So definitely checking planter depth and checking it across the field on your different soil type areas within the field, heavier ground versus lighter ground. And just, I would say, making some notes. So next year when you go back out again to just try and do a little bit better job in checking that planter depth throughout the field. And especially when you start into a field, because you'll be changing soil types. That would be one. And then same with Jenna, we have similar issues with corn and or soybeans. Now is the time, like Jenna was saying, where you can see your equipment issues. If it's corn, if it's always the 18th row over on your 18-row planter, that's an indication that something was off on one of your row units, and just, we do plant soybeans with a drill still, so just checking to make sure your drill is planting as best as it can, things like that. Now is a good time for. The other thing I would say is maybe looking for any compacted areas of the field or things like that you could work on mitigating over the years, not this year particularly, but over the off season. And I think the last thing I would add in there is with all the rain we've had this year, this is when your tiling, I guess, ability or drainage ability in the field. How good was your tiling? Now's a year where if you've spent the money and maybe systematically tiled a field, this was a year where it really paid off. Just with the amount of rain we had, that field would dry out 1 to 2 days faster than somebody that didn't have that even spacing across the field, or maybe it was on 30-foot centers and you just hadn't taken the time to do like 15-foot centers or something. We're really seeing those differences this year in being able to catch that window. And we're tight on planting that if you had an extra day to plant because your field was drier, or maybe it was drier and you could get your pre-emerge on for soybeans, things like that, like those windows are really showing this year that you can actually get your work done in a timely manner. So.
Ben, Holly mentioned, kind of digging up some of those plants to look at planting depth. I'm curious, when those do get dug up and you're kind of looking at that, you've now got this, little plant with root. Is there anything that the roots of a plant, is there a story that they can tell us at this time of year?
Yeah, so I think if you're already out there and you're already digging, it's not bad to take a look at those roots. I know I was at one call this year where the growers had some yellow corn. It was kind of taking a while to come out of it. They were wondering if it was a fertilizer injury issue. They were using some micros this year. So if you're digging already, I think it's important to know that, corn has a regular root structure. It's not just a bunch of random roots coming out. And if you familiarize yourself with what should be there, you can compare and say, oh yeah, that part's there, that's there, things look good. Or you can look at it and go, there's really supposed to be a radical coming out the tip of this kernel, but I don't see that. And there's a little blackened stub. Some of those things can help you identify if there's fertilizer injury going on, if there's been some kind of feeding or that sort of thing. So I think it's important to familiarize yourself with what should be there. And because you're digging already for seed depth, take a look at those roots and maybe rule in or rule out any issues you might think you're looking for.
because it is one of those things, and we talk about depth. One of the challenges that we have, I know in your area you'll have it too, Holly, is basically the challenge that even in one field, that depth can be off. Jenna, you mentioned just the variability in equipment. There might be tools that exist that are better at getting that depth right every time. Mine is not one of them. It requires the reset, which is fine. I can do that. I guess I'm kind of curious, and maybe this is, a question for Ben and Holly first, and then I want the same question for you, Jenna, in terms of canola, is what should I actually be setting that when I know there's going to be variability in the field, when I know that the hard is going to be, if I put it too deep, if I put it at 2 inches, it might be 3 by the time I get to the sand at the back of a farm. Holly, I'll start with you. What is the right depth? What should I be looking for and know and make a mental note for next year that I've got to adjust for?
I feel like that was a good segue for the agronomist answer of it depends.
That's all you always tell me that, all of you.
But I would say that you want to set up your planting depth for maybe not the very best part of the field, but kind of that in between. So you've got some heavy areas in the field, and you've got those sandy knolls, but choose a spot in the middle that feel like it wasn't too cold and it wasn't too wet. Somewhere in the middle, and just set it up for there at a 2-inch depth, because ideally 2 inches, it gives you some insurance. You're not going to get too shallow. And if you go a little bit deeper, it's okay. And that way, when you get on the harder ground, which is your heavier ground, if it shortens up to 1.5 inches, you're still okay because your planting depth is good. You're going to get good root formation. And then when you get on the sands, if you're over 2 inches, sandy ground is more forgiving and the plants can get out easier and they'll be able to grow through that. So that would be my rule of thumb. If you end up going too shallow in the moderate part of your field, then when you get onto that heavy area, you might only be at 1/2 inch, and then they might have not gotten into moisture and they're germinating later, and it's going to create more of a hassle. I think it's just a general rule of thumb is shoot for a little bit deeper than too shallow and having worse problems.
Agree with that, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. I think like Holly said, in your toughest spot of the field, you want to make sure that you're getting at least a depth you think is reasonable enough, which I think in most cases probably isn't less than 1.5 inches, like Holly said. So in that growing season, that's probably checking those toughest spots, like you said, heavier textures, or for some growers, making sure you're getting depth on some hard knolls or things like that. Again, there's been work done. I know Pioneer's done some, and others work that, on reasonable soils, light to medium textured soils, there seems to be forgiveness for going depth. I think in some of the work they're looking at as much as 3 inches. I don't think you're going to target 3 inches, but if you're humming and hawing and go, well, in these spots it's not quite enough, I think there's some forgiveness for going, erring on the side of being a little bit deeper if you're not getting it in those tough spots. And I think that's in the growing season decision. Maybe longer term, if you're having issues, maybe it's a sign you need some more down pressure to make sure you are getting depth in some of those tougher spots of the field, if that's a chronic thing every year.
Jennifer, canola, it's not quite as deep, but, kind of the same question in terms of it's really easy to go into the field when we start seeding and take that quick depth check and say, yep, we're good. What should we be doing now, and what kind of depths as we do start scouting fields should we be looking for to see if we actually were able to hit that target?
Like Holly said, it depends. But,
you must be an agronomist.
Yeah, it always depends. It always depends. You can say that and Mother Nature about 9 times in a conversation with a farmer. But, with canola, because it is such a smaller seed, you can't do those deep depths. So the number one thing is do not chase for moisture. I've seen guys do it. It never turns out. That is always a wrong decision, because if you're chasing for moisture, even if it's a dry year, chances are it's not coming out of the ground before it will make a difference anyways. So I always tell guys about 1 inch, right? Because if you go at 1 inch, even if you have the most perfect machine ever imaginable, which I'm pretty sure 90% of all farmers think their machine is perfect in most years. But you're always going to have a little bit deeper and a little bit shallower. If you start going in at setting your drill at 1/2 inch, I've seen an awful lot of seeds not even make it into the ground this year because it's been dry, because the ground's been hard. So it's really important that they go out there and take a look, because my number one call is, things aren't growing. What's going on? So sometimes it's because that seed didn't even make it into the ground. Sometimes it's because that seed was set too deep, 2 inches plus. And on dry years, even if you think that you're sitting at an inch, you're pulling up larger chunks of dirt because it is so dry and it's so hard there, and it's pushing it in deeper. And that's pretty much my number one call at the beginning of the season. And it's normally either too deep seeded or the seeds didn't make it in. It's sitting in dry dirt. So in a perfect world, though, if you could target about that inch, 3/4 of an inch, that would be the best.
It is funny how we as growers tend to, you mentioned the fact that, well, it must be the seed's fault. That's definitely the seed's fault. Or I know we ran into the issue that, well, it must be the sensor's fault. Like the sensor must be bad. Oh no, we didn't block a tube. That's why it wasn't working. Like it is amazing how we tend to kind of reflect on that, well, it must be something else. But it really is a case of, if we go out and spend a little bit of time right now scouting, actually looking to see what the issue is, we can get such a better picture with that. And I know, Holly, you mentioned, just this morning, even you are going out and you've got a drone, kind of up in the air to help you get a better sense of some of these things. Give me an idea what you use that technology for, and how it can help a grower make a better decision going forward.
Sure. So this morning I was out, and I have been several times over the last week or so, doing corn stand counts. We have the capability to count corn at V2, V3, and we have software to do actually V emergence to like spike to V1 stage, that we're fine tuning it, but you can still use it. Satellite images are also available. The plants right now are a little small to see on an image, so that's always a limitation with those. But any of the tools you can have to get an idea of what you're looking at. The other thing we can use the drone for is just get a general a plant health image of the field once it's up. To assess if there were issues with, if their starter fertilizer wasn't, or if they thought it wasn't working in parts of the field. You could see patterns like that in a larger area.
Jenna, because, for us, I know Holly mentioned the satellite imagery. That's new for us. I haven't had the maps before, and now I get the maps. For when you're talking to growers who also have access to that, is there a way that they can use those maps to help them with, make even if it's just scouting decisions or decisions about, how things have gone so far in, what is so far the short part of the growing season? Is there an opportunity to use that? Is it something that it's just kind of technology that we haven't figured out? Like, what do you advise growers on?
So I quite like it, especially for the early season. Because usually in the early season, we still have enough moisture where there's some green matter that they can actually see something out there in my drought-forsaken area here. But I really like it with regards to insects, because it did a really good job of showing where we have bare spots. And in this particular field, it was a really high infestation of cutworms. So it was a spot in the field where it was tough to walk to. We don't get fancy drones like what Holly has over in Eastern Canada. So the imagery did a really good job of showcasing to the grower, he didn't have to spray the entire field, but he was able to go to that pocket with his high clearance sprayer and spray it out for cutworms to give that field a chance to come back. So yeah, I definitely do think that there's, some opportunities with satellite imagery. And, of course, as the season goes on, if it is a drought, a little bit tougher, but provided that there's moisture, yep, there's definitely some opportunities there.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, if you can add in,
yeah.
And just I had another thought on the drones or the satellite imagery. It's a tool that then allows you're going to go in that field and walk it anyways. It allows you to direct your walking to areas that are impacted. So you'll spend the same amount of time, but you can actually get more value out of your time spent in the field rather than, we've probably all wandered a field at some point where you need to walk the whole thing, but you're just kind of wandering around. Or this is more of a directed pattern of you're going to areas that look like there may be a problem.
Because Ben, when Holly and Jenna talk about, kind of looking at maps like that to help you. Maybe it's to determine where to go in a field. Maybe it's to look for a problem. What are some of the problems that you can identify? If I'm a grower and I do get, here's a drone shot of my field, I don't really know what I'm looking for other than, it's a bare spot. It must have been too wet there or something. What are some of the other pictures that it can show in terms of, whether it's streak, whether it's compaction, whether it's other things that I can keep an eye for?
I guess, like they said, being able to direct yourself. Again, if you're going to go to the field, bring a trowel, do some digging, try to see why those spots are showing up in that imagery. But like you said, I think you still need the boots on the ground to actually verify, what is the cause there.
So if I'm putting boots on the ground, over the next, and we're, it's quit raining here now. I'm hoping in the next couple of days we can do that. I'm taking my tape measure and trowel, Ben, and I'm going to, look for plants and do my, kind of stand count and all of that. But here I am scouting. I might as well make the most of my scout session. What else am I looking for at this time of year as I do scout fields? What else do I need to be keeping an eye for?
Yeah, so I guess if you're already going out and doing these checks, I know it's maybe not in the scope of a stand checkup, but thinking about your herbicide program, are there weed escapes? How good was your weed control? Do you need to come back? Some of those things. I think to get the most out of your scouting time, you're already investing the time in it. Definitely some of those things would be things you could do at the same time while you're already going out to do these checks.
Or vice versa, if I'm doing the check for weed pressure, I can bring the trowel and tape measure with me.
Exactly.
Jenna, what about for you? If, growers are out scouting now, what else should they be looking for? Or what could they be looking for at this time of year?
Big one for our area is insects. Right now, the flea beetles came in late this year. So because it's been kind of cool and not much moisture, there's a lot of stagnant plants that aren't advancing like normal. So insects is a big one. We want to make sure that we protect it if there are insects there. And also, our seed treatment provides control for about 35 days. Now we're pretty much at the end of those 35 days, which makes it even more important to try and check that. Because if we no longer have that seed treatment protecting the plant, we may need to do other measures in order to, protect that plant establishment out there.
Holly, last word to you today is really in terms of, here I am. It's you've convinced me after years of doing the podcast that I'm going to do real scouting. What do I need to look for and what do I need to be prepared for over the next few years to make sure that, in hopes that the crop that I've planted does have that stand count, does look like there's potential there, to make sure that that potential holds?
I think the first thing is, like we talked about weed control, just making sure on corn, we're usually pretty good at getting some pre's down. So just making sure your weeds are being controlled the way you wanted them to. We did have some cool, wet conditions. So just making sure those pre's are activated and you're not getting some weed escapes through that where you might need to come in crop and clean them up. Beans, depending on where you were in my area, some areas got their pre down, some we needed to plant. So the pre got kicked to the wayside, and we'll go in crop and put some herbicides down. So just making sure you're knowing which weeds are there and choosing the right product to get on those acres, and also trying, I'm going to throw my agronomist hat on and trying to mix up your modes of action too. If you're going in crop, there's some in-crop options. You don't have to go in with two of the same products 2 different times. So just making sure you're making some good decisions there. That's the main one. We're kind of in that critical weed-free period window for both corn and beans. And then, just assessing plant stand, fertility levels. We have a lot of growers that don't put all of their nitrogen fertilizer on up front. So just, start thinking about that window of where do you think this corn crop is going to be, and what you're going to come in to side dress with later on in there.
That's great. Well, certainly, hopefully, it dries up a little for you, Holly, in your area. You get the rain, Jenna, in your area, and we can get kind of that, consistent emergence, no matter what the crop is, so that we can have as successful a 2025 as we can have. So, but really appreciate the time that you've all spent at kind of giving us that window in terms of what we do need to be looking for at this time of year. So, Ben, Jenna, Holly, thanks very much for joining the podcast today.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for this episode. Don't forget, whether you listen to us on a podcast app or watch the episodes on YouTube, if you subscribe, you'll be among the first to know when a new episode drops. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can always follow Pioneer Seeds on X at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA or me at Fresh Air Farmer. And don't forget, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.